Now let's turn to the situation in the UK. For the next 25 minutes, Professor Mike Gordon is going to talk about the political ethics and ministerial irresponsibilities in the United Kingdom. Mike Gordon is Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Liverpool. He is also the co-editor of the excellent UK Constitutional Law Association blog, for those who know. I'm sure there are many of them in the room. A specialist of the British Parliament, he is the author, among many other publications, of a book entitled Parliamentary Sovereignty in the UK Constitution, Process, Politics and Democracy, published by Hart Publishing in 2015. His research are manifold, and he develops expertise in parliamentary sovereignty, Brexit, and the relationship between the UK and the EU, constitutional theory, and especially democratic political constitutionalism. His current work deals with the doctrine of ministerial responsibility, and today he is going to develop conventions, codes, and commissions dealing with politic ethics and ministerial irresponsibility, I would say, in the UK's constitution. Professor Gordon, the floor is yours. And I take this opportunity to thank a lot the translator for their work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as all the speakers have done so far, I'd just like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak at this excellent event, and also for putting the event together, because the topic, as I think we've seen in the contribution so far, is an extremely important one. The political ethics, ministerial responsibility, political trust and the constitution, these are important topics, and I think it's very interesting for a British scholar to come to continental Europe to discuss this, because I think there's not enough discussion of these issues in the UK itself. So it's very interesting to see them standing alongside issues in relation to France, Belgium, and the European Union more generally. So the title of my presentation, which builds on an article I published earlier this year, is Political Ethics and Ministerial Irresponsibility, Conventions, Codes and Commissions in the UK's Constitution. And what I'm going to do in this paper is a few things. Talk about recent practice in the UK government in particular, relating to political ethics rules that structure or ought to structure the behaviour of government ministers in the UK. And I'm going to argue that what we see under two recent governments in particular is a practice not of ministerial responsibility, but ministerial irresponsibility. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But I think it's just worth saying that I'm going to focus particularly on the political ethics rules that apply to government ministers within government. There are other rules and other processes for parliamentarians as members of the House of Commons or House of Lords. And so I'm focusing in on one particular, but I think central part of the UK's system of political ethics today. I'll also then, after talking about this recent practice, talk about the evolution of the rules relating to political ethics in the UK's constitution. There is quite interesting change that has happened and change which is ongoing in the UK at the moment. And I'll talk about the kind of transition we've seen in the nature of these rules from constitutional conventions, non-legally binding rules, but nevertheless regarded as binding within the political system, codes increasingly capturing those still non-legally binding rules, and then some current proposals by the new Labour government for a commission on ethics and integrity in politics. I'll then finish off by just trying to draw on identify some wider questions and implications. So in the UK, and as I say, focusing on the idea of ministerial responsibility, we have, as the UK is an uncodified constitution without the written central document, as I'm sure you're all aware, we focus for our core rules of political ethics relating to government ministers, we focus on constitutional conventions, rules which are non-legal, not laid down in a statute, but are nevertheless regarded as binding on the participants in the system. So these constitutional conventions are the key norms of political ethics as they apply to government ministers in the UK. And they're an interesting set of rules, and they create concurrent responsibilities for ministers. Responsibilities to Parliament, the legislature, that the government is accountable to in a broad sense, and as are individual government ministers working in their particular areas, but also responsibilities to the Prime Minister as head of government. So there's an interesting dual nature in which of these rules. They create dual accountabilities, in a sense, to different actors. Broadly, as a matter of established practice in the UK, we divide the rules, the conventions of ministerial responsibility into two parts. We have individual ministerial responsibilities and collective ministerial responsibilities. There is no authoritative definition of what these rules involve, but there are, I think, persuasive academic accounts trying to break down those rules a little bit further. For individual responsibility, I like the account of Professor Rodney Brazier, who talks about ministers have individual responsibility for their personal conduct, the policy of the department of which they are a head, and the civil servants who answer to them. In a collective sense, I like Professor Geoffrey Marshall's account, also 3 principles, pleasingly, which says that the government collectively has responsibilities to retain the confidence of Parliament. It must retain the confidence of Parliament to remain in office. There are rules relating to unanimity, insofar as government ministers are required to unanimously accept official government policy and support it in public or resign from the administration. And finally, there are also rules within government collectively applying between ministers creating rules of confidentiality. Secret discussions, and this reinforces the unanimity principle, discussions in government should remain confidential, because then when the government makes a decision, they can all unanimously support it in public without difficulty. So those are the basic rules in the UK. And these rules have been strained, stretched, perhaps beyond repair, we might say, in recent political practice. And the article that I was working on, which was published in the Public Law Journal earlier this year, focused particularly on the eras under Prime Minister Theresa May, 2017 to 2019, and then her successor, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as well. And these are two very interesting periods in recent British political history in government, because they are very different prime ministers, May and Johnson, very different characters. The narratives, as I'll talk about in a minute, of their administrations were quite different. But there's a lot of continuity as well, I think we see, between their governments in general and also the approach to ministerial responsibility, or the lack of approach to ministerial responsibility during their tenures. And I think what's particularly striking about these two eras of government in particular, as I say, spanning 2017 to 2022, when Boris Johnson was forced to resign, is that we see, first, violations across all those 6 core conventions of collective and individual responsibility that I just highlighted a moment ago. And we also see an unprecedented volume of resignations during the period. So, to illustrate this, it might be difficult to see on the screen, perhaps. This graph is one attempt by the Institute for Government, an influential think tank in the UK, to chart the number of resignations occurring under different prime ministers in recent British political history. The data itself is actually, it's good that they have compiled the data, because there is no definitive official record of this. You can see roughly most of the lines go up at a relatively gradual pace. We would anticipate there would be some scandals in all governments over time. Some ministers will have to resign, some ministers will break the rules. The May period and the Johnson period are the two lines going almost at a certain point up vertically. And so there is something very different in terms of the volume of violations of ministerial responsibility rules, political ethics rules in this period. And I think the fact that this is happening in consecutive governments together, as I say, with continuity between them, makes this a really important period to try to understand. It looks to me, just looking at the core data, that there is a step change, or it looked to me that there was a step change in this area in the UK. I won't go through all of the details of both of these different governments, because we could be here for a very long time. There are many scandals, there are many interesting incidents and episodes. I will just try and draw the broad strokes here. In the May period, I argue that this is primarily a period in which we see failures of collective responsibility. Lots of this driven by the Brexit process and the UK government's continuing failures to agree positions on Brexit, to agree to have unanimous positions at all, cabinet ministers very publicly arguing with one another about what government policy in relation to the negotiations for exit with the EU should be. We saw, under May, 41 resignations in 36 months, comparing that to the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, New Labour period of 13 years, in which there were 46. We can see the differences here. Again, the David Cameron era, 16 resignations in six and a half years. So there is something dramatically different about the number of ministers resigning from government on the basis of ministerial responsibility rules in this period. Also interesting about these resignations, it's not resignations from ministers on one side of the Brexit debate. Theresa May's governments were challenged from both sides. 10 resignations from ministers who wanted a softer Brexit, a closer relationship with the EU. 12 resignations from ministers who wanted a harder Brexit, less of a relationship with the EU. So no real clear consistency at all in terms of the political narratives driving the resignations, and a series of very senior resignations as well. 5 cabinet ministers, 6 ministers within the department responsible for exiting the EU itself, including 2 Secretary of States, the ministers in charge, 1 Foreign Secretary, which happened to be Boris Johnson, who would go on to be Prime Minister as well. So the scale of chaos, uncertainty created by this volume of resignations in this period is fascinating. But what's also interesting is while the primary narrative, the primary thing driving the ministerial responsibility resignations under May were collective responsibility failures, we see lots of other examples across all the other rules. We see precedents relating to the confidence rules, breaches of unanimity rules more away from Brexit by some ministers, breaches of confidentiality rules, which are quite rare by ministers in this period, and a number of scandals relating to ministers' personal conduct. Particularly this was around the time of the Me Too crisis coming from Hollywood into Westminster, so there were a couple of resignations relating to that. And also, as I'll talk about later, one extremely rare example of a resignation, a minister resigning because her department, or at least on the face of it, her department or her civil servants had made a bad decision as well, although that one might be a bit more complicated than it looks. That's Amber Rudd. So if the Theresa May governments were primarily a story about failures of collective responsibility, the Johnson government, Johnson succeeded her in 2019 after she resigned, unable to get a Brexit deal through. The primary narrative here is about failures of individual responsibility, and in particular, the Prime Minister's own personal conduct. Johnson was beset by a series of different scandals during his time in office. Wallpapergate, a scandal about the payment for gold leaf wallpaper, allegedly gold leaf wallpaper in the Downing Street flat. The parties that were occurring during the COVID-19 pandemic in Downing Street and his awareness or knowledge of them. A corruption affair where where an MP who had been found guilty of breaching House of Commons rules relating to payment by other companies to lobby ministers. Johnson tried to retain him in office and caused a huge scandal. And also then finally, the straw that broke the camel's back in a sense, a sexual harassment affair where Johnson had reappointed a minister to his government, Chris Pincher, and claimed he had not heard before about previous sexual harassment allegations when in fact he had. This triggered again another spectacular series of resignations, 55 resignations over 3 days after 2 senior members of his government resigned. And again, much like the May period, just as primarily this was about Johnson's failures of individual responsibility, we see many other examples of the rules being violated as well. And for reasons of time, I won't talk through them, but there are plenty of examples. So what I've tried to argue in relation to this period is that it seems to me that something significant has changed in the way these political ethics, ministerial responsibility rules operate in the Constitution. The conventions still are there, they still persist. And so I think what we're seeing, and this is why I would argue this is ministerial irresponsibility defining the UK's constitutional rules in this area now, is not changed to the substance of the rules, which are largely as they were before, both in relation to individual and collective responsibility, but changes in the way the framework of accountability of which these rules are a part are functioning, and arguably also becoming normalised, becoming a regular part of the way government operates in this area in the UK. So when I talk about irresponsibility, I'm not trying to suggest this is just utter chaos and everybody doing what they like all the time, although perhaps that's true. And it's also not meant to be overly pejorative, overly critical in a political sense of the government. Because irresponsibility in this sense is not just about aberrations, it's also about systemic problems. And I think that is what is going on here in the UK in relation to the operation of these rules. And there are 5 features of this period, 5 things that I think are the kind of deeper shifts relating to the UK in this period. The frequency of resignations that we've talked about. And one of the interesting things is that this changes what used to be the traditional scepticism about ministerial responsibility. If you look at traditional scholarship in say, the 20th century or before, scholars will say, well, ministers don't usually resign. But that's because the rules are working in a mundane sense, that we have ministerial responsibility, and the fact that there are no resignations is an indication of it. This has completely flipped it around, that we have many, many resignations and an absence, it appears to me, of responsible or functional government. There are also some other features of this period. One is gaps and imbalances in the application of rules. Some rules, like the rules relating to personal conduct, are very important, and we see many resignations in relation to them. Similarly, the rules about unanimity and agreement within the government. Some rules, there are very few resignations. So, for example, the examples of ministers resigning, taking responsibility for departmental failures, are few and far between. Even in an era where we see many, many resignations, there are still very few resignations for that. And we might regard that as just as, if not more important than ministers taking responsibility for their personal failings. We see tensions in government and those rules being exacerbated by the political conflicts of Brexit and the aftermath of Brexit. I think that's a really important feature of this period. We see particularly in the Johnson era, challenges for the UK in relation to the Prime Minister's position as both the arbiter of the rules, as the person who is the head of the government, but also, in Johnson's case particularly, the chief violator of the rules as well, and how we deal with that tension between that dual role for the Prime Minister. And we also see the purposes of the rules, the normative purposes of the rules failing as well. I argue that there are 2 different normative purposes for these rules. One is that they're a tool, a set of standards for citizens to use to critique the conduct of government. And the other is that if government is responsible and the rules work, then it legitimates government. It justifies the power of elites. And neither of those 2 things was happening effectively in this period. I also think, although this will remain to be seen, and we will see this over the coming years, that actually this is not just some people will say, was this just a blip? Was this a temporary thing? Is it over now? Was it all about Brexit? To some extent it was. But I think we also can see the endurance of this approach to responsibility rules in subsequent governments as well, where responsibility is becoming increasingly personalised, performative, government is volatile. The Liz Truss era of 49, 50 days in power before being removed seems to fit that pattern. The Rishi Sunak era as well, numerous resignations from his cabinet in a relatively short space of time, suggests to me that we are still feeling the effects of this. But now there is a change in government. As of July, we will see what happens next. So this is where we are in terms of recent practice and the operation or failure to operate of these rules. Just more broadly then, how are the rules evolving in the UK at the moment? So as I've said, primarily we use, for our rules of ministerial responsibility, we rely on constitutional conventions, non-legally binding rules established in the 18th century, so pre-democracy in any sense in the UK. But there has been a change over time. Increasingly, in the late 20th and now the 21st century, we have what we call the Ministerial Code. There's an associated document called the Cabinet Manual, but the Ministerial Code is the key one, which starts to codify some of these rules. It doesn't make them legally binding, but it starts to formalise those rules. And that, as I'll talk about in a second, is becoming an increasingly important document. And then the next step, I suppose, is where we are at the moment. The current debate is about the possibility of legislative or further institutional reform being needed, partly in response to the kind of tensions I was identifying a few moments ago about ministerial irresponsibility. So the Ministerial Code is, I would say at the moment, is the central document that we rely on increasingly when we look at these rules. It's written by the Prime Minister. It's been published since 1992. It was originally published as Questions of Procedure for Ministers and then was rebranded as the Ministerial Code in 1997. It existed unpublished probably since the Second World War, but it's been published since the early 90s. And the role of the document is to set out the standard of conduct expected of ministers and provide them with guidance on how to discharge their duties in an ethical way, in a responsible way. It's not just entirely abstracted from the wider context of conventions. It connects with the external standards quite closely. One good example being the 7 Principles of Public Life, established in 1995, things like selflessness, integrity, objectivity, honesty. They are written into the code in an annex. So it's not just a government-produced document. It connects with the pre-existing constitutional standards. But the tension here around the code is that we have the Prime Minister as the author of the code. It is issued in the Prime Minister's name. The Prime Minister is the arbiter of the code. They get to decide whether it is breached and what the consequences of a breach are. And they are the enforcer of the rules, or not enforcer of the rules as well. So the Ministerial Code, in terms of transparency, seems like a positive move for the UK. But there are concerns around its structure, I think, which we need not to ignore, especially because it's becoming increasingly very prominent in UK's discourse. Now, most stories about government or scandals, a journalist will find the Ministerial Code and they'll point to the bit of the Ministerial Code that looks like it's being violated, and they will say, the Ministerial Code is violated, this is a scandal, and the Ministerial Code becomes the framework through which we have all these debates about ministers, the propriety of ministers' conduct. But there are concerns, I think, about the effectiveness of this, particularly around the role of the Prime Minister. There are questions, as I've said, about unanswered questions about the relationship with the wider conventions. Is the Ministerial Code now the key document? Do we still rely on the conventions as well? We kind of do both, but it's unsatisfactory. What if the conventions and the code contradict each other? Another concern around the code is that the primary forum through which these rules are litigated is intragovernmental. This is a code written by the Prime Minister telling his or her ministers how to behave, and so there's a risk that Parliament becomes sidelined in this. The parliamentary side of ministerial responsibility, the responsibility of ministers to Parliament, becomes secondary. And also then that scrutiny can become excessively technical. We look at the technical rules of the code and we say, did the minister break it or not? And almost a pseudo-legalistic quality to the debate. So I'm not saying the code is a bad thing. I'm saying there are nevertheless concerns and constitutional questions about what it means in terms of its prominence in our practice. And then the final thing, just to finish off, because I know I'm at time now, is what might happen next in the UK. And so in a sense, this conference is very interesting, thinking about the different ways in which political ethics rules and standards can be institutionalized within constitutional systems. So the main reform proposals at the moment in the UK are to provide a legislative basis for the Ministerial Code, not necessarily making the code legally enforceable, although there have been some judicial review cases trying to make the Ministerial Code enforceable, which have succeeded to a limited extent. Another option is increasing the autonomy of a role, a relatively obscure role called the Independent Advisor on Ministers' Interests, an individual appointed by the Prime Minister to sometimes advise them and sometimes not about violations on the Ministerial Code. Practice is very, very inconsistent and uncertain. But some people are saying, well, maybe we should put that role on a statutory basis as well and then give the advisor more autonomy. And then the most recent proposal is that of the Labour Party, who've just been elected to government since 2022, who have been arguing in response to the Johnson-May era and their failures for an ethics and integrity committee to be created. The challenge of this is that, as is perhaps unsurprising to any of us, now they're in power, they seem to be diluting the proposals to some extent. They didn't really have a clear vision for what this commission was going to look like to start with. So, for example, at points they suggested it might have an investigative role, making recommendations to the Prime Minister about sanctions. Now they're saying it might be an umbrella body, just looking at practice across the range of regulatory institutions we have in the UK. There are questions about where it fits in a crowded landscape of other committees and commissions. the government has confirmed that, well, has said for now there won't be a legislative bill introduced in this first session to underpin it, so it will be a non-statutory committee, which is something that lots of people are concerned about because maybe it doesn't signify the constitutional seriousness of the proposal. So there are concerns that that proposal might not be going anywhere and that change may be illusory despite the change of government. But there are also wider questions as well about, are we still looking at form over substance here? Are we still failing to get to grips with the deeper cultural issues? How you do that, of course, is very, very challenging. And so my final slide, and these are really just questions, I suppose, to finish on, is clearly in the UK we've been through this extraordinary period. It seems to me that there have been some changes to the way our political ethics rules, which are going to endure for a while. And it doesn't necessarily suggest, I don't think we've got reform proposals yet which are capable of getting to grips with this. The ministerial code experience suggests that reforms of that kind have a limited impact because, of course, this entire May Johnson era occurred under the existence of a ministerial code, which made little difference. And the more creative institutional reforms that Labour have proposed seem to be running into a number of constitutional and political barriers, and it seems like the window is closing on the chance to do something significant there. And so I guess then this comes back to the first panel. You know, what are the connection between the changing practice around these rules in the UK and democratic disaffection in the UK, citizen alienation more generally in other states? And I think as well the question of what does this mean for the state if we get into a situation where we have almost perpetual irresponsibility of ministers? What does that mean for the authority of the state and the capacity of the state to intervene in promoting the general welfare as it ought to be doing? So there are some big questions I think that flow from the failures in the UK in this area as well. So I'm sorry I've gone over time, but thank you very much.
Only 5 minutes.